Hi, this is Mike Evanoff, and we're recording a series of videos about Google Earth Enterprise. And in this video we're going to talk a lot more about creating an imagery resource. So we kind of glossed over it pretty quickly on one of our videos where we were doing the big picture, just building a globe quickly. But now we're going to step back and really kind of talk a lot about creating of imagery resources. So with all things resource, we open the Asset Manager. So the Asset Manager is where we create all of our resources and create all of our projects. And I'm going to be working with Google Earth 3D. We're building a 3D globe, so I'm going to make sure that I have my 3D globe selected. And I'm going to create 3 imagery resources for this video. And so I click the New Imagery Resource button, and I'm going to go pick the blue marble again. And we're going to do it a little bit more slowly this time. I know that we built the blue marble once already. But we'll open up the blue marble just in order to talk about this interface a little bit more. So if you look in this dialog box, we have a number of different options that you can have for creating your globe. So let's go through them. First of all is the acquisition date. Now, why would you want to even put an acquisition date? Well, there's 2 reasons. Reason number 1 is in the bottom left of the client, you'll actually see that acquisition date. So if you want your users to be able to see when was this image taken, if you add an acquisition date, they'll be able to see that. The other reason is Google has something called historic imagery. So you can create a historic imagery project that allows users to kind of fade back in time. So if you have, for example, Washington, D.C., and you have imagery from 2012, from 2009, from 2000, you can add all of that data to the same globe, and the users will go back and say, oh, what did it look like in 2008? What did it look like in 2000? If you're going to create a historic imagery project, you have to have an acquisition date for every single resource, right? So if you know that you're going to make a historic imagery project, you have to tag every single image with a date. So that's the acquisition date. The other dialog box you have here is the provider. So when the user zooms down into this imagery resource, some text will show up along the bottom. In Google Earth on the internet, that's typically copyright text. So you'll see where did we get this imagery from and who's the owner. So you can tag any one of your images with a copyright provider. The next dialog box talks about mask. And the idea of mask is imagery comes to you in a file, and it's typically rectangular, right? So you have some kind of a rectangular image. But satellites don't always fly north-south. They oftentimes fly in a diagonal. So you'll have the image itself will not fill up the entire rectangle. And the edges and the corners will be black. They'll either be black or white. So what masking does, Fusion consumes that black area so that what you're left with is just the image itself. Mostly you'll pick auto mask. Almost all of your images you'll pick auto mask, and you'll let Fusion consume that mask for you so you don't have to do it by hand. For the blue marble itself is like the only image. It goes from -180 all the way to +180, and it touches itself along the international date line. So you don't need to have any mask whatsoever on the blue marble. Almost all of your other images you'll be auto masking. The final one was have mask. And what have mask means is that you have by hand created that mask. And we use those on coastlines. If you go to Google Earth on the internet, you fly into a coastline, that's all been hand masked. Because we have somebody that looks at the imagery and they draw a line that's maybe a mile off the coast, so that we'll see the nice blue marble imagery coming up for the ocean and not have a bunch of different colors for the ocean. So you don't typically see people doing that. I mean, it's an option, but you're almost always going to be using auto mask other than for the blue marble with the no mask. Finally, we have a bounding box. So maybe you have an image that covers a very big area, but you don't want that much data. You only want a certain piece of that imagery. So this gives us the ability to restrict how much of this particular image we pull into the product. Okay, so we'll save this one. And I've already saved it, so I'm not going to save this one again. So we've created the blue marble. Now, we'll close this one. Now we're going to create not a blue marble. We're going to create just a regular image. So this is what you will be doing, for most of your time, is creating imagery that's not the blue marble. So we'll create one, and we have under our imagery directory, there are like 3 more images beyond the blue marble. So we'll bring in the Landsat imagery. Now in this case, we are going to auto mask. And and we're not creating a historic imagery project, so I'm not going to, well, I'll add a date on this one just to show you how it works. It's pretty straightforward. You just put in the year, the month, and the date. And we can tag this one with a provider. Okay, but mostly you're just going to do exactly what I showed here. Now, we have a few more dialogues to show you, and one of them is feather, tolerance, and hole size. So let's kind of describe what those are, because they have all to do with the masking. So you'll notice if I went to no mask, those dialog boxes gray out and you don't get them anymore. So when we do the auto mask, those dialog boxes come up again. So feather. Feather is when 2 images come together. So I have maybe a low resolution background and a high resolution image on top of it. In Google Earth, by default, there's no hard edge, right? I mean, you don't see one image butting up to the next one with a clear seam. Feather is, the images kind of blur together along the edges, so it gives this nice kind of aesthetic transition from one image to the next. So feather, a feather of 100 is pretty good. I mean, looks good. It's what we use on the internet, so it's that's a very good default value. The tolerance tells Fusion how aggressive it should be at consuming that mask. So we talked about masking, which you have those black corners and the black edges. Sometimes the pixel values on those masks are not completely black. They might be like 1 pixel value off. So instead of a value of 255, it'll be 254. The problem is Fusion, as soon as it hits something that's not completely black, it will stop. And it'll stop consuming. So you won't have the mask completely gone. You'll still have some kind of a black border around your image. A tolerance value of 2 is a really good compromise. If you have the tolerance value too high, Fusion will consume the image itself. If you have a tolerance of 10, it'll start consuming the dark imagery along your borders. But a tolerance of 2 allows Fusion to really consume almost all the masks that required consuming without having Fusion eat the image itself. And finally, hole size. Some images will have a black area in the middle, maybe because there's some water that comes up as black, or maybe if you have a whole bunch of images that you're creating one resource out of, there might be one missing in the middle. And what Fusion will do is it'll turn that black. It won't make it transparent. So hole size tells Fusion to look through your whole image and look for areas that are, that meet the mask criteria, that would be, either black or extremely dark, and turn those transparent. Now, hole size is in pixel value, is in pixels. So you want to you're trying to tell Fusion to look for a big area, right? You're not telling Fusion to look for a couple little dark pixels. You're telling it to look for a big area that's black. So if you have an image that has, black stuff right in the middle, you can tell Fusion to go look for areas that are at least like 200 pixels wide that meet the mask criteria, and then Fusion will turn those transparent. If you put a hole size of 1, Fusion is going to look at your entire image pixel by pixel, and anything that's really dark, it will become transparent. So you get this like weird Swiss cheese kind of looking image that you really don't want. So don't make a hole size less than a couple of hundred of pixels so that Fusion is looking for a big area to turn transparent. Or just set it to 0 and Fusion won't even try. That's the typical value. Okay, so we're going to save this one. This was our Landsat, and I'm making sure I'm putting it in the right folder. I'm putting it into our video folder. And I'll save that. And then I'll build it. One other dialog box that I didn't mention was the fill white. Sometimes the mask isn't black, it's white. So if you find that you have a resource that has white borders, just click this one dialog box and Fusion, and then reprocess. And Fusion will recreate the mask and consume that white border. And then you can pick which band Fusion will look at while it's consuming that mask. So maybe you have infrared imagery, maybe you have imagery that has a particular band that is dark or specifies the mask. You can change which band it is. But 99.9% of the time you can just leave it as the default and the masking will work fine. So now we have this Landsat resource, and you can see that the provider is in AHI and it's in progress, and as before I can double click on the in progress and we can see how much more time it's going to take. So we can click on the log file and it says that it's going to take another 26 seconds to process. So we'll let that one process for a little while and we'll start another one. So we'll create another imagery resource. Now this imagery resource, I'm going to add multiple images to this one. So under San Francisco Grayscale, I have a bunch of TIFF files, and I can just shift click and open 4 of those files. And then I can add, this was the San Francisco North folder, I can go into San Francisco South folder and I can grab those as well. So now I have one resource that has 8 images in it. We can do this, and why would I want to do this? Why would I want to just create one resource out of 8 images? Several reasons. One is that organizationally, it's a lot easier to keep track of one resource than it is to keep track of 8 separate resources. And typically you'll get a hard drive that has hundreds of images, and you're much better off creating a small number of resources that are easier to manage rather than going through and creating hundreds of different resources. The other reason is that it makes Fusion a little more efficient. The processing goes a little bit faster because Fusion itself doesn't have to keep track of all those different resources. So when you can create fewer resources out of your imagery. Now this comes with one huge caveat. These images, if you're adding multiple images to a single resource, those images have to essentially be identical. They have to have the same projection, they have to have the same resolution, they have to have the same color table. They essentially have to have been from the same sensor at the same time frame. Because if you add like a 15-meter image and a 1-meter image, Fusion just can't work with that at all and it will fail. So you have to make sure that these images are the same resolution and the same projection and essentially the same. So I'll save this as San Francisco Gray and I'll build that one too. Now, we finished processing the Landsat image, and once that image is finished processing, I can drag it over into the preview window in Fusion. I can zoom to the layer, and I can preview the image. And you'll notice that the mask wasn't completely consumed. You can see how it has those black edges all the way around it. So if you have that problem, if you realize, my mask didn't finish processing correctly, you can actually go back to that resource. So I'll double click on that resource, and you'll notice I left the tolerance at 0. So if I bump the tolerance up to 2, like I suggested earlier, we can save it and build it. And the building is going to go very quickly because all I'm going to do is reprocess the mask. I'm not going to go back to the image and recreate all the tiles and do all that. I mean, I'm really just recreating the mask. So that should go pretty quickly, and you'll see that it succeeded already. So now if I go back to the preview window, I'll get rid of that one and then go pull my freshly rebuilt Landsat image into the preview window. And I should see an image now with the mask completely gone. So by increasing the tolerance values, we can reprocess the mask and have the image look the way that you'd expect it to look. And then the San Francisco, again, we can see how long it's going to take to build. And since this was a fairly large resource with multiple images in it, this one's going to take a little bit longer to build. So we'll let that one process for a little while. Finally, I wanted to show you what happens if you try to add images of different resolutions to the same resource. So if I go to create an imagery resource, and I want to add the 15-meter along with the Landsat. So I'm adding 2 dissimilar images that have different projections and different resolutions. I can open those and then save this. And I'll call it will fail. And by the way, when you're naming your resources, you can't use spaces or special characters. No apostrophes, no quotes, no ampersands, no exclamation points. So basically just text, underscores, dashes, So in the Fusion guide, there's information about which characters can and can't be used, but you're safest if you just stick with numerical and underscores. So we have our will fail, and I'll build it. So what you see in the Asset Manager is that that resource is blocked. Okay, so something went wrong. And you'll see this, it's not uncommon to see blocked. So what do you do? What do you do if you see blocked? Well, we double click right where it says blocked. And it brings up all those different tasks that have to happen. And if you keep expanding, you'll finally find one that's failed. If you have something that fails, it blocks everything up above it. So the entire process stops because something failed. And we can click on this log file, and we can see why it failed. So we have a Fusion fatal command here, and it says incompatible spatial reference system. So that means that they had the different projections. The spatial reference was different for these two different files. So if that happens, we'd have to open up that resource. We'd have to open up that resource and get rid of one of them. And now if I save this one and build it, it should process just fine because it's just got that one resource in it. So that's sort of a little bit more information about creating resources of imagery. The last thing we need to talk about with imagery resources is the Mercator. So in Google Maps on the internet, it's a Mercator projection. Google Earth Enterprise by default is a flat projection. Some of our customers are doing development on the internet, and they want to take all of that information and bring it in and have it work exactly the same on Enterprise as it does on the internet. So if that's the case, you have to build Mercator resources and build a Mercator project. So you just click that Mercator and go to Mercator Tools, and it's the same process. I new Mercator imagery resource. I can go find my images and create Mercator resources. So you create Mercator resources and a Mercator project, and then you create a Mercator database and publish out that Mercator database just like you would for a flat projection database.